Good morning, everyone. This is actually the second to last part of Chapter 7. I did decide to break this Chapter 7 parts. So the first part will deal with homeostasis, and the second part we will focus on pathology. Okay, so let's get started with homeostasis. Some of this is repetitive. We've actually mentioned it already, but mature bone throughout life is going to be metabolically active. All right, it will continue to be very active throughout life, even beyond the bone growth that you see at childhood and adolescence. So as I've mentioned before, right, we're going to do this remodeling throughout life. And also, so for homeostasis, we're talking about calcium homeostasis, and we're going to see just how important calcium is and why we're going to have such an elaborate process that's going to take place if we have any kind of a disturbance in calcium homeostasis. And really the reason for that is because if we're too high on calcium or too low on calcium in the body, it will disrupt the functioning of other organ systems, especially nervous system and muscular system. So yeah, bone remodeling, what is it? It's really consisting of an interplay between bone deposition by osteoblasts and bone resorption by osteoclasts. And so most of this activity involved with remodeling is going to be taking place near the periosteum and endosteum of bone. And so we have these little packets called remodeling units, and these are just containing these osteoblasts and osteoclasts that are actually coordinating the remodeling process. But remember that osteocytes, all right, osteocytes are communicators. And so osteocytes are going to be communicating between these osteoblasts and osteoclasts, kind of giving them guidance on when to do bone remodeling. So something called mineral deposition, this is simply just referring to when we are depositing minerals, all right? So the ones we really care about or that are most significant for bone homeostasis are going to be calcium, of course, and phosphate, because calcium and phosphate really make up the bulk of the mineral part of the osteoid. Okay, but there are other ions that are going to be part of this osteoid, of course. But the deposition, mineral deposition, is when we actually retrieve these items from the blood, from our diet, all right, after we've had food or drink. We're going to take these minerals, mainly calcium and phosphate that we're concerned about, and those are going to be deposited in the bone and stored there for later use if needed. And remember, osteoblasts are the cells that are going to be making the matrix. And so instead of fibroblasts, we have here osteoblasts in the bone that are going to make collagen. Remember, there's a lot of collagen in the bone, which is really what makes bone so strong. Now you can have something called abnormal calcification or ectopic ossification. And this is referring to when we have calcification occurring somewhere else outside of the bone, somewhere else in the body, such as a soft organ, all right, like the lung, brain, eye, muscle, tendon, or artery, and not just these places, all right? These are just some examples, but really any other place where we have a soft tissue or soft organ, if we have calcification occur there, it's not normal, all right? So that's referred to as ectopic ossification, or you could say ectopic calcification, which is an abnormal kind of calcification, because you don't want calcification occurring in these soft tissues. All right, and this can occur for a number of reasons. It could be due to a problem properly doing homeostasis, where we're actually not taking calcium from bone, or this could be due to a disease. There are many different diseases that interfere with hormone function, which would result in having calcification occur elsewhere in the body. This could also be due to high high calcium diet. All right, if you're consuming too much calcium, this could occur as well. So there are a number of different causes to this. So bone deposition is when we're going to lay down and osteoblasts are going to perform this. Now, what triggers deposition? Not all the causes are actually known for what will cause deposition, but we do know a couple of triggers. So mechanical signals, all right, this would involve lifestyle, okay, lifestyle and life experience would be considered mechanical signals. Again, if you're having a lot of physical activity or increase in physical activity, we would see an increase in bone deposition. If you're having a decrease in physical activity, it would be the opposite. We would see a lower level of deposition, right? Because again, your bones are responding to your lifestyle, all right? So if you place extra demand or extra stress on the bones, you will increase this deposition and vice versa. Something else that will trigger a deposition is just going to be related to how much calcium and phosphate we have there from our diet, all right? So that obviously will influence how much deposition we're going to do, right? If we're taking in a lot of calcium, okay, and phosphate, that will tend to increase the activity of osteoblasts to help create this matrix so that we have some place to store that calcium. Something else that can trigger deposition would be also the concentration of calcium binding proteins. Okay, if you have a lot of calcium binding proteins, then that might encourage an increase in osteoblast activity. Other triggers that we know for sure that do affect deposition. Okay, much of the trigger to bone remodeling, especially at the level of osteoblasts, are going to be these hormones. Parathyroid hormone, which we'll talk about. Testosterone, right? So remember that testosterone is going to be a major hormone involved in bone deposition during adolescence, all right, for bone growth and length. And then there's growth hormone. Of course, growth hormone has the most direct effect on bone development during adolescence. Growth hormone has a direct effect at the epiphyseal plate to cause chondrocyte development. So its growth hormone effect is directly at the epiphyseal plate. Testosterone is going to cause an increase in osteoblast activity for a little while during the testosterone spike at puberty. Then eventually, at the end of adolescence, we see a decline in level, a little bit of a decline in the testosterone level, and this is actually going to end up signaling a closing of the epiphyseal plate later on. And then PTH is the homeostasis hormone. This is the one we're going to talk about here in a minute. And it will have a very important role throughout life on calcium homeostasis, and it will indirectly increase the activity of osteoblasts, indirectly, usually. What about resorption? So resorption is the opposite. This is when we're going to take minerals from the matrix and send them to the blood. So this would involve the activity of osteoclasts. Remember that osteoclasts have a unique structure, this ruffled border, and this is going to contribute to the osteoclast's ability to break down the osteoid, which will free up calcium from the matrix and allow us to send that calcium to the blood. So HCl, hydrochloric acid, is one of the substances that's going to be released by these osteoclasts to dissolve bone minerals. It's not going to dissolve calcium, okay? Excuse me, but it will dissolve other aspects of the osteoid. The osteoclast also has acid proteases. These are enzymes that are going to break down the collagen. Again, all this is, playing a role in bone remodeling. For bone remodeling, we're going to build up bone tissue, and then we're going to break it down and build new, and then break it down and then build new. Okay, this is a continual process throughout life to regenerate, basically, our bone tissue throughout life. So as far as orthodontic appliance like braces, right, for teeth, all right, these basically are going to help to reposition the teeth by encouraging resorption and deposit at the bone, okay? So just a little point of interest for those of you who may be going into dental hygiene. Remember, resorption is a function of osteoclasts, all right? Osteoclasts are basically going to dig little grooves into the bone and seal that area off and break down the matrix inside. All right, osteoclasts are going to phagocytose, okay, so they're going to bring in that matrix, and they're going to start to demineralize it. They're going to start to dissolve it and break it down. And this will help liberate calcium from the matrix. When that calcium is liberated, the calcium is then sent to the blood. So this would be a situation like, if we're low on calcium in the blood, we may see this happen. Right? Remember that the ruffled border of these cells is going to increase surface area and also help block off the area of the matrix that's being digested, so that it's a sort of a more controlled process, so that we're not destroying or breaking down too much matrix. And again, osteoclasts have these lysosomal enzymes and acids, okay, that are going to digest that matrix. Okay, once resorption is complete, osteoclasts actually undergo apoptosis. All right, so once osteoclasts go through a round of resorption, they're no longer good anymore. They're only good for that cycle, for that one cycle of resorption, and then they will actually undergo apoptosis, and new osteoclasts will be synthesized through another cell line, another kind of differentiation. Now, how do we activate osteoclasts? It involves parathyroid hormone, all right, so PTH. Now, the activation of osteoclasts by PTH is indirect, all right, so PTH does not go to the osteoclast and tell it. It's a more indirect pathway that PTH will take, and it will be through osteoblasts, and it will also be through osteocytes, because remember, osteocytes are communicators. So calcium homeostasis, right? Well, remember we have phosphate there as well, stored in the bone. Calcium and phosphate will be stored there. And both of these, are used for much more than bone structure. You know that phosphate, for example, is a component of DNA, RNA, ATP, phospholipids, and pH buffers, and these are just a few, all right, of items in the body that are going to be made up of phosphate. So we really do need to make sure we have enough phosphate, and again, that's why we're going to be storing this in bone, so that we have enough to make these really important components here. Calcium, of course, calcium is needed for a lot of very important functions. Communication between neurons. Okay, we need calcium for our brain cells to communicate. We absolutely require calcium for muscle contraction. You can't do muscle contraction without this calcium. You remember other functions. It's related to blood clotting, calcium is. And exocytosis, I didn't mention this before, but exocytosis is reliance on calcium. I will bring this up again when we talk about the nervous system. Really important role there for the release of neurotransmitters through exocytosis in the brain. It is dependent on calcium. Okay, so reminder of why are phosphate and calcium important? Okay, and of course, calcium homeostasis, how much calcium we have, the balanced level of calcium is of course dependent on dietary intake, also with how that balances with excretion. Okay, and so as these are needed, we're going to withdraw these from the bone based on whatever the purpose or aim of the body is at that time. Okay, this is really repetitive here. Okay, again, remodeling is going to occur continuously, and it's regulated by genetic factors, many different types of genetic factors. It's regulated by homeostasis and lifestyle, of course. Okay, so as far as how we're going to control blood calcium hormonally, all right, when we're controlling this hormonally, it's going to operate on a negative feedback loop, all right, in order to control calcium levels. And again, a reminder of, how important calcium is for many different physiological processes. I already mentioned nerve transmission, muscle contraction, blood clotting, secretion. As far as gland and nerve secretions, we're talking about exocytosis. Now, we also need calcium for cell division. Calcium also serves as an enzyme cofactor. Some enzymes will not function unless calcium is in the area. All right. So again, reiterating, all of the different roles that calcium plays and why it's important to maintain proper levels of calcium. Also recall that you need calcium in the intestines to, you need vitamin D, right, in the intestines in order to absorb calcium. So a couple of clinical terms here. So we have something known as hypocalcemia and hypercalcemia. Hypocalcemia means we have low levels of calcium. Now this can have two different effects, and it's kind of confusing. You'd really have to go in and study this in detail if you really want to know. But I would like you to know that in general, hypocalcemia will cause an inhibition of muscle cells, right? Because calcium is required for muscle contraction. Okay, so if your levels of calcium are too low, you will not be doing muscle contraction very well. Now, in some cells, it actually has the opposite effect. Okay, but that relates to the concentrations of other positively charged ions, which will vary. So we're really not going to go into that because it's a little more complicated, all right? What I would like you to know in general is that hypocalcemia with low levels of calcium, you would see an inhibition of muscle cells. Now, you would also see an inhibition of neuronal communication. You would see an inhibition of all the things that we associate calcium with as far as function. What are some causes of hypocalcemia? Well, vitamin D deficiency. If you don't have vitamin D, you can't absorb calcium from the intestines. So therefore, it's not going to go to your bloodstream, and it will not be stored in bone, or, it's not going to go to your bloodstream, right? So you can't use the calcium. So it's important to know this, all right? If you have a vitamin D deficiency, all right, you're not having enough calcium in your body. You're not absorbing it. Okay, you're not absorbing the calcium in the intestines. All right, so this can be associated with, let's say if you're a child and having vitamin D, bone growth will be stunted. So this person will have a short stature. They will not grow very tall. All right, will have light bones, lightweight bones, which can lead to a lot of other problems. Okay, so vitamin D deficiency. Other causes, diarrhea. Well, yeah, we're excreting it. Thyroid tumors. Okay, thyroid tumors, and the reason thyroid tumors can cause hypocalcemia is related to a hormone called calcitonin, which we'll talk about. Okay, calcitonin regulates when you have high calcium levels. The thyroid will be active. So basically, if you have a tumor of the thyroid, you're having too much calcitonin. And calcitonin, the hormone calcitonin, will result in a decrease in blood calcium level. Okay, so high activity or tumors of the thyroid can cause hypocalcemia. Also, what can cause hypocalcemia would be the opposite here if we have an underactive parathyroid gland. Okay, parathyroid gland secretes parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone has the effect of increasing blood calcium levels normally. So if your parathyroid gland is underactive, then that can result in hypocalcemia because we have lost the ability to increase blood calcium levels when we are low. Now, you may want to come back to this point after we actually talk about homeostasis at the level of thyroid and parathyroid, and you'll get this a little better. It'll make a little more sense why you would see hypocalcemia in a thyroid or with an underactive parathyroid. What about hypercalcemia? So if you have too much calcium in the blood, then of course you may see hyperactivity when it comes to muscle contraction, okay? It also will have a stimulatory effect on brain cell communication, right? So this will have an excitatory effect. Now again, like hypocalcemia, in some cells, too much calcium can actually cause the opposite. It can cause underactivity in some cells, but again, it depends on the cell type, and it depends on the exchange of other positively charged ions that are in and out of that cell to make it excitable or not excitable. Okay, but again, that's a more complicated topic. What I would like for you to know is that hypercalcemia is associated with excitation, all right, especially in muscle cells. Now, what can cause this? Well, certain bone disorders, all right? If we're having problems with, let's say, for example, our osteoblasts, maybe we're not doing bone deposition properly for whatever, okay, which can be associated with certain bone disorders. Diet, of course, if you're having too much calcium, too much of anything is a bad thing. Now, it's also associated with a side effect of some medications, which can affect the deposition of bone matrix. Now, too much blood calcium can lead to calcium deposits elsewhere. All right, remember hypercalcemia. If we're having too much calcium, we can see that calcium will not be deposited in the bone, but be deposited elsewhere. All right, we can see this happen in blood vessels, all right, which would be resulting in arteriosclerosis, meaning you're going to have basically a calcium plaque built up in your blood vessel wall, and this would block blood flow, of course, leading to other problems. Kidneys, we can have these calcium deposits in the kidneys, which would lead to kidney stones. All right, so parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. So this is really important, probably the most important part of this first half of this lecture, all right, is understanding how these hormones affect blood calcium level, okay? So first of all, parathyroid hormone, or PTH, it is produced by the parathyroid glands. So if you look at the thyroid, on the posterior part of the thyroid, you have these 4 little glands on the back, all right? These are parathyroid glands. Parathyroid gland will secrete parathyroid hormone when we have low blood calcium. You must know this. When we have low blood calcium, parathyroid hormone is released by parathyroid glands. This parathyroid hormone then is going to have effects at several parts, okay, or in several areas. Mainly, its effect is going to be at the bone. And what it's going to lead to is an increase in osteoclast activity, okay, really important. Now, PTH does not directly stimulate osteoclasts. PTH will stimulate osteoblasts And the osteoblasts will signal osteocytes, and then the osteocytes will trigger or stimulate the osteoclasts to do resorption. All right, PTH will go directly to osteocytes, and then those osteocytes will stimulate osteoclasts. So there is, it's indirect. Okay? So the idea is PTH does not directly stimulate osteoclasts. It does so indirectly through its communication with osteocytes or osteoblasts. So what happens then when we do this resorption, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're activating osteoclasts to do resorption. What does this do? Well, we're breaking down the matrix, we're freeing up calcium. That calcium is then released into the blood, raising levels to normal. Once we reach normal levels of calcium, PTH secretion will stop. And this is why it's considered negative feedback. Okay, so that's parathyroid hormone. The other hormone that's associated with calcium homeostasis is calcitonin. Now, calcitonin is going to do the opposite of PTH. So first of all, where is calcitonin? Calcitonin is made by these cells of the thyroid gland. They're called parafollicular cells, or sometimes called C cells. And these are located in the thyroid gland, not parathyroid, thyroid. So calcitonin will be released from the thyroid in the opposite situation. All right, if we have high levels of blood calcium, if we have too much blood calcium, then calcitonin will be released from the thyroid gland and end up lowering blood calcium levels. This is a temporary effect. So we'll start with a little more detail about calcitonin. All right, remember calcitonin secreted by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland when calcium levels are too high. Now, how does calcitonin do this? Okay, so remember, calcitonin is going to end up lowering blood calcium when it's too high. So how does it do this? It's going to inhibit osteoclasts. So that means we're inhibiting bone resorption. We're going to inhibit osteoclasts, okay, so that we don't have any more calcium being freed up from that matrix and sent to the bloodstream. We want to stop the activity of osteoclasts. Okay, calcitonin is also at the same time going to have the effect of stimulating osteoblasts, so that all that extra calcium that's in the blood will end up being mineralized, okay, calcified into the bone matrix. So we're going to take all that calcium from the blood, and osteoblasts are going to deposit it into bone. Okay, so this is the effect of calcitonin. It influences both osteoclasts and osteoblasts. Okay, and you should know which way, if we're inhibiting or stimulating here, right? You should make sense of that. It makes sense that we want to inhibit osteoclasts in this case, because we don't want any more bone resorption happening if we have too much calcium in the blood. And it makes sense that, on the other side of the coin here, we're going to stimulate osteoblasts, because we need to do something with all that extra calcium in the blood. We're going to store it. We're going to deposit it back into the bone. Okay. Now, the thing about calcitonin, it really has a weak effect in adults. All right. The main homeostatic control of calcium in adults is going to be parathyroid hormone. All right, because it's much more often going to be the case that in an adult, we're going to temporarily have a low blood calcium. Okay. It does calcitonin, so it does have a weak effect in adults, and it plays a little bit larger of a role in children. And the reason for that is, not due to levels of secretion of calcitonin. It's really due to the increased level of osteoclasts that you find in children. Okay, because remodeling is faster, all right, in a growing person. All right, remodeling happens faster in a growing person, which means that osteoclasts will be more active. just like osteoblasts will be more active, all right, in a child. So because we're already having, we're having this increase in osteoclast, calcitonin is going to have just a greater effect in a child because they're already having this increase in osteoclast activity. So because there's so much more osteoclast activity, this inhibition of osteoclast is going to be more significant if we have this calcitonin released. Okay. All right, here is a graphic of how this calcitonin is going to work. So if we look over here to the left, this is the beginning, all right? This is the beginning of the situation. We have too much calcium in the blood. This is going to result in calcitonin secretion from the thyroid gland. This is going to have two effects. We're going to have a reduction in osteoclast activity, which leads to a decrease in bone resorption. The second effect is that we're going to have the opposite effect on our other cell, the osteoblast. We're going to have increased osteoblast activity, which leads to an increase in bone deposition. So these two actions together will lead to a drop in blood calcium. Okay, so that was calcitonin. Now let's talk about parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone, remember, is going to be involved in regulating blood calcium levels for the other reason, that calcium levels are low. Okay, when calcium levels are low in the blood, this is when we see the action of parathyroid hormone. PTH is secreted by parathyroid glands. Okay, now there are multiple effects from parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone will end up raising blood calcium level in 4 different ways. Okay, one of them I'm not really going to ask you about, but let's start with the first one. So parathyroid hormone will result in an increase in the number of osteoclasts. Okay, it will actually signal an increase in osteoclasts. And so therefore, this is going to result in an increase in bone resorption. All right, that should make sense. If we have low blood calcium, we want to increase blood calcium, so we're going to increase bone resorption. Okay, so one effect is at the level of the osteoclast, which I'm going to describe here in a few, that this effect on osteoclast is indirect. For example, PTH does not go directly to osteoclasts and shocking them to start increasing bone resorption. Okay, it's an indirect effect, but at the end of the day, it's going to lead to osteoclasts increasing bone resorption so that we increase blood calcium levels. Another effect of PTH is actually at the level of the kidney. So PTH will circulate down to the kidneys and increase calcium reabsorption. Okay, so that means the kidneys are going to retain calcium in response to PTH. So we will lose less calcium. Okay, so we're going to hold on to that calcium. So one level here is actually at the kidneys. Another one, and this is one I'm really not going to ask you about because we really didn't talk about calcitriol, and I don't think we really need to, but basically what we're doing is calcitriol is going to help indirectly raise the levels of calcium. It's another hormone that does this. So you should just know that basically PTH is going to also increase calcitriol synthesis, and calcitriol is also related to levels of calcium in the blood. Okay, but again, we're not going to go into calcitriol. Also, PTH will affect osteoblasts. Okay, PTH does directly affect osteoblasts. PTH will bind to the surface of PTH receptors on osteoblasts, which will cause these osteoblasts to be inhibited so that we have a decrease in bone deposition. Okay, makes sense that, if we're trying to get more calcium to the blood, We don't want to be depositing more calcium into the bone. Makes sense. So here's really the story and sequence. All right, you should definitely know the story and sequence here with PTH. You have low blood calcium. Parathyroid gland is stimulated to release PTH. You have increased PTH going in the bloodstream now. PTH will directly bind to osteoblasts and stimulate them so that osteoblasts do not do deposition. So don't get confused when it says osteoblasts are stimulated. Okay, it's like you're stimulating inhibition. All right, so osteoblasts will not do deposition. Now, osteoblasts are considered to be stimulated though because osteoblasts will communicate with osteocytes about this. So osteocytes are communicators. Osteocytes will then stimulate osteoclasts to do resorption. Now it says here OBs or osteoblasts and or osteocytes will stimulate our osteoclasts. So again, PTH is binding to the surface of receptors on osteoblasts to stimulate them to, number one, stop doing deposition. But the osteoblasts are actually going to be able to sort of sidestep these osteocytes and go ahead and communicate with osteocytes. So osteoblasts can be stimulated, in this case, to stimulate osteoclasts. Okay, so main idea here is osteoblasts and osteocytes are going to be stimulated by parathyroid hormone to stimulate osteoclasts to do resorption. Calcium is then going to be released to the bloodstream, at which point our homeostasis is restored and PTH levels will then decrease. So these hormones, PTH and calcitonin, and other hormones like GH, growth hormone, testosterone, these are going to determine whether and when we do this, when we're going to have remodeling, okay, in response to blood calcium levels. But really, it's mechanical stress that will occur where in the bone it happens, depending where on the bone that increased stress is taking place. So here's a picture of when we're dealing with parathyroid hormone with homeostasis. So we start here over on the left, and this is going to happen when we have a deficiency in blood calcium, low blood calcium. This triggers the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. And remember, this is going to have like 4 different effects. Number one, we're going to end up with an increase in osteoclast activity, regardless of how that happens. Okay, but you should know that it's going to be osteocytes that signal this osteoclast, and we can also have our osteoblasts due to its stimulation by parathyroid hormone to actually end up directly increasing osteoclast activity. Okay, so increased osteoclast activity due to communication from osteoblasts and osteocytes will cause an increase in bone resorption. Second effect, remember PTH also binds to osteoblasts, right? So PTH in this way will directly influence osteoblast activity by causing it to do less bone deposition. All right, and then the next effect is at the level of the kidney, right? We're actually going to have an increase in phosphate excretion, okay? And this is going to cause, and this was actually relating to the hormone calcitriol, which again, I said I wasn't going to ask you too much about because I really didn't include calcitriol in this. So for you all, just understand this as, we're going to have more phosphate excretion because we don't want to do any more deposition, right? We don't want any more bone deposition. So we're actually, at the cost of saving our calcium levels, going to lose a little bit of phosphate. Fourth one is, at the level of the kidney, and yeah, we're going to conserve calcium. We will decrease calcium excretion And all of these together, all right, are going to end up serving to increase blood calcium level. Here's just another way of looking at it. It's a more basic way of looking at PTH and its effect on blood calcium. Okay, so here's your thyroid gland, and remember, behind your thyroid gland, you have these 4 little tiny glands. These are your parathyroid glands. Okay, when we have low blood calcium, PTH is going to be released from these parathyroid glands, and at the end of the day, right, we're going to have some intermediary signaling between osteoblasts and osteocytes, but at the end result here is we're going to have osteoclasts increase their activity. All right, we're going to have an increase in bone resorption from these osteoclasts. This will free up calcium and we'll end up with more calcium in the bloodstream. Okay, so really those were the big deals for how calcium homeostasis. All right, calcitonin and parathyroid. Those are really the big hormones when it comes to calcium. All right, so those are important to know. But I do want to mention some other hormones that play a role, all right, in the density of bone. Okay, like how dense is the tissue or how dense is the matrix in the bone. And that also play a role in remodeling or turnover of bone deposition. Leptin is one of these. Leptin is a hormone that is actually released by adipose tissue. And this hormone is going to travel to the hypothalamus. Remember that really important part of the hypothalamus. So you remember the hypothalamus is playing a role in body temperature regulation. Well, that's true. Hypothalamus plays a role in other very important instinctual drives of the human body. And one of those is eating, right? We have an instinct to eat or to not eat. So the hypothalamus controls this instinct that will actually control eating behavior. Basically, your satiation center is located in the hypothalamus. So when you feel full, that feeling of fullness, or actually I should say satiation, not to the extent where you're over full, like you stuffed yourself, but once you feel content, like, okay, I'm good, I've had enough to eat, that means you're satiated. So the hypothalamus is what makes you feel that satiation. And so once you feel satiated, you should then begin inhibiting your eating behavior. You should stop eating, right? And so, you know, most of the time, most of us do this in response to the hypothalamus telling us, I've had enough to eat, I'm going to stop eating. So, and it's interesting because, yeah, this hormone is actually made in adipose tissue. And so it's sent to the hypothalamus when you've had enough to eat. Okay, this is like the physical part of you saying, I've had enough to eat. And then we're going to the psychological part of you saying to try and stop you from eating anymore. So leptin is the hormone that is released that's associated with this sequence of events. Okay. So yeah, that's one hormone, interestingly, that's really serving as like a link between the most physical part of you to the more psychological part of you, all right, to stop you from eating. Now, it has been found in some people who are morbidly obese that they lack this hormone or they don't make enough of this hormone, and so they're not able to behaviorally stop eating because their adipose is not releasing or not making this hormone to send to the hypothalamus to tell themselves they're satiated to stop eating. So as far as bone, all right, you know, it's leptin may actually play a role in bone density by actually inhibiting osteoblasts. Okay, it's actually going to stop bone deposition. Okay, because it's, well, we've had enough to eat, We've had enough. That means we've got enough calcium, we've got enough phosphate, we've got enough from our diet. We've got enough of it. We don't need to deposit it, therefore we need to excrete it. Okay, so understand what leptin's doing here, right? It's inhibiting bone deposition because there is not a physiological need to store that stuff because you've already had enough. You already got enough. So inhibit osteoblasts from depositing the calcium and phosphate, and instead, that will indirectly encourage excretion of it. Okay. So what about serotonin? Yeah, serotonin kind of has a similar, it's sort of similar to leptin in this way, all right? Serotonin is a neurotransmitter. Now, serotonin is, interestingly, it's made and secreted in the brain, but we also have a form of serotonin that is made in the gastrointestinal system, okay? So serotonin, again, serves similar to leptin, like a link between the real physical part of us and the psychological part of us. You know how when you feel satiated, when you feel satisfied after, let's say you're really hungry and you have a great meal, and as long as you don't overstuff yourself, like you feel satiated, you feel much better, right? You feel much better because of serotonin. Serotonin gives you that feeling of contentment, all right, or comfort. All right, so serotonin regulates too, right? To regulate your mood. Like I said, contentment, feeling satisfied. It also regulates sleep. Okay, that's why, like, if you've had too much to eat, you're ready to go to sleep. All right. Now, again, look at the relationship here between eating and psychology. All right, with these. All right. So, what is serotonin going to do at the level of bone? It also, like leptin, is going to interfere with osteoblast activity. Okay. Basically, it's going to help inhibit bone turnover after a meal. Okay. So that, again, a little bit similar to leptin's effect on the bone, that bone is just going to be locked in, okay? And we're not going to do any more bone deposition. Okay, so it has a similar effect as leptin. So be familiar with those two. What's going on with those two? So again, control of remodeling. A lot of our remodeling is based on mechanical stress. Okay, the bone reflects stresses that they encounter. This relates back to a law that I mentioned in one parts of chapter 7 called Wolff's Law. And so what happens here, what Wolff was trying to explain was that yeah, the density of bone basically is going to reflect what kind of stress is placed on them. Okay, whenever there is weight bearing happening on a bone, muscles pull, right, on bones. Okay, so what we're going to do, what that's going to result in, is an increase in the size of muscle attachments, and it's also going to result in an increase in bone deposition. Okay, so again, bones will form based on the stress that's placed on them. Don't worry so much about the detail here, because I don't really have a good picture of that, so we're not going to worry about it. Main idea of this is, is this, right? Bone reflects the stresses they encounter. That is the main idea with this. Bone responds to your lifestyle. Now, Wolff's Law also explains handedness. Okay, so why a person is right or left-handed, or not why, I shouldn't have said that. Not why you're right or left-handed, that's dictated by the brain. Okay, but the point here is that if you are right-handed, for example, then the bones in your right hand and your right upper limb are going to be thicker and stronger than the left side because you're using them more, right? Okay, you're placing more demand on the bones on that side. So yeah, those bones are going to be thicker and stronger. And of course with left-handed, right? Okay. You'll have large bony projections on bones where muscles are used the most. Okay, at those attachment sites on bone, those muscles that are used the most will have larger projections. And again, I think I've mentioned this before, like people like weightlifters, they're going to have really large, they're going to have much more, like say the greater trochanter and lesser trochanter of the femur. Those are going to be much larger than a person who is not a weightlifter because they're placing an increased demand on their bones by the exercising of the muscle. Now, the other way, if you look at bones of a fetus, or if you look at a bedridden person, okay, their bones don't have very much feature to them, meaning muscle attachment sites are much smaller, okay, because they are not placing stress on their bones. There's no need to have extra large attachments. So this is really just a reminder here of, well, first of all, there are a lot of factors that are going to affect bone integrity, all right, and bone growth and bone remodeling. It says here there are at least 20 or more, all right, hormones, vitamins, growth factors that affect it. We've only mentioned a few of them. Okay, you can actually study in much more detail all the activity going on here with bone tissue. All right, and remember, bone growth is rapid in puberty and adolescence, and this is because of the surges of hormones that we get during this. All right, we do get a surge of growth hormone, which, remember, growth hormone has the most direct effect on bone growth, or let me say, growth hormone has the most significant impact on bone growth in adolescence because it affects directly at the epiphyseal plate. Estrogen and testosterone, all right? Remember, we're having a surge of these hormones at puberty, and these are going to affect bone growth and actually also increase activity at the epiphyseal plate, as sort of indirectly, but yes, very important roles these two play. Yeah. I think I already mentioned this, big deal, but yeah, girls grow faster than boys. They reach a full height earlier because estrogen has a stronger effect than testosterone. But here's the thing, testosterone sticks around longer. All right, so males are going to grow for a longer period of time, and they're also going to get taller, typically. Now, the caveat to this is that testosterone and estrogen, while they play an important role in stimulating bone growth during puberty, when we are done with puberty, these steroids will actually have the opposite effect, and they're actually going to cause at the end of adolescence, so basically in your early adulthood, these hormones then are going to have the opposite effect, and they're going to close the epiphyseal plate. So now, this is why, if you are a child, you should not take anabolic steroids, particularly testosterone. If you are a child and your bones are still developing, you should definitely not take testosterone because it's going to have the opposite effect of what you want. If it's a child and their bones are still growing in length, look, keep in mind, these hormones are very tightly controlled in how much is secreted for very specific, important reasons. Okay, too much testosterone is going to actually close the epiphyseal plate earlier than it needs to, and that is going to, again, have the opposite effect of what might have been desired by giving that child testosterone. They're going to have a short stature. They will not grow tall. Okay, so that is where I'm going to stop this this lecture. All right, that was mainly all about homeostasis. So I'll pick up the second part with pathology. All right, So we'll deal with that. Hopefully I can get that up here for you tomorrow. All right, so have a great day. See you later.